The mail-order groom arrived broken. The giant widow healed him with silence. The stagecoach rattled into Red Bend under a hard, merciless sun, its wheels grinding through dust that rose like a warning. The townspeople watched without pretending otherwise. They whispered before the door even opened. And when the final hinge groaned and the pale, exhausted man stepped out, the whispering turned into a hush so sharp it felt like the sky itself stopped breathing. Because he wasn't what a mail-order groom was supposed to look like. His coat torn, his left hand trembling, his eyes scared of the light, as though he had arrived not for a bride, but from a battlefield no one else could see. The driver dumped a suitcase at his feet and climbed back into his seat without a word, and the groom, Jonas Hale, 26, ghost-thin from hunger and miles, flinched at the sound as if each thud cost him something he didn't have left. 3 short steps forward and he nearly tripped on his own boots, but he steadied himself, lifting his chin toward the boardwalk, even as sweat stung his eyes and made the bruises on his jaw darken, because he had promised himself he would stand, at least for the first hour in this strange town where even the wind seemed to judge him. The sheriff leaned back against a post, thumbs tucked into his belt, and cleared his throat like a man watching a show he didn't buy a ticket for. Some of the women murmured, "Poor thing," while others narrowed their eyes, calculating if they should pester the widow again about changing her mind, because nobody believed a giant widow would truly marry a broken groom. Especially a groom who looked as though he hadn't eaten a full meal since spring thaw. Jonas dragged the suitcase toward the steps, but paused when the boards creaked loudly. Too loudly, beneath a newly arriving shadow. A shadow that covered him from the sun the way a barn roof covers a calf in its first storm. And the murmuring died so suddenly that Jonas thought his ears had failed him until he turned and saw her. Mara Calder, the giant widow of Red Bend, taller than any man on the street, shoulders broad from ranch labor, hair braided down her back like a thick, dark rope, face soft in the way dawn is soft just before it breaks into gold, and the moment she stepped beside him, every rumor about her being too large, too intimidating, or too lonely to marry, shriveled into silence because she did not look intimidating. She looked steady, calm, and unbearably kind. She didn't speak when she reached him, not even a greeting, because she saw the tremble in his hand and the way his chest rose too fast from trying not to panic. So she simply bent down, lifted his battered suitcase with one effortless motion, and nodded toward the quiet road leading to her ranch. And that simple gesture, one woman carrying what he could not, felt like the first real mercy Jonas had tasted in years, a mercy so gentle it nearly broke him in front of everyone. The sheriff rubbed his jaw, muttering, "Well, guess that answers that," while a few townspeople exchanged guilty glances, suddenly unsure if they'd misjudged both bride and groom. Jonas swallowed hard, unable to find his voice, but Mara didn't seem to need it. She stepped half a pace ahead of him, leaving space for him to walk beside her rather than behind, and the way she waited, patient, still unmoving until his shaking boots finally caught up, told him more than any promise spoken at a wedding ever could, because in that blazing, judgmental afternoon, she offered him something he had never been given in his entire life. A beginning that didn't ask him to be stronger than he was. And as they walked away from the staring town, Mara's shadow kept covering him, step by slow step, until the heat didn't feel quite so cruel anymore. The walk to the Calder Ranch stretched across open land, silent except for the sound of boots scuffing through dry weeds. Jonas kept his gaze low, afraid of how much his shaking legs betrayed him. Mara slowed her pace, without drawing attention to it. And the quiet between them settled into something strangely gentle, as if the widow understood that a man who arrived trembling beneath a merciless sun didn't need questions. He needed space wide enough to breathe in, and her presence beside him was that quiet, steady space, holding back the world without ever touching him. A hawk circled above, its shadow gliding over the dirt path, and Jonas flinched as if it were a threat before catching himself and stepping a little farther from Mara so she wouldn't see the reflex he hated. But she noticed anyway. Not with pity, not with alarm. Only with the same calm she had offered in town, adjusting her stride so she neither crowded him nor drifted so far that he felt abandoned in a place where he knew no one and nothing felt familiar. Sweat trickled down his back, soaking the torn fabric of his shirt, and every few minutes he wiped his palms against his trousers, ashamed of how clammy they were, ashamed of how his chest tightened with each new mile, ashamed that he had answered a stranger's marriage because the alternative was starving in a mining town where no one cared if a man vanished into the dust. Mara walked with her braid swaying down her spine, the simple rhythm of it strangely comforting, and Jonas caught himself watching it without meaning to. Not because he found her intimidating or even beautiful in the way people talked about beauty, but because the braid didn't shake like he did. It moved with purpose, strong and sure, almost like the woman carrying his suitcase had decided that whatever happened today, she would not let him collapse alone on the roadside. They passed a split-rail fence, where a bay horse lifted its head and snorted, ears flicking curiously at the newcomers. Jonas stiffened, stepping back so fast he nearly stumbled, and Mara stopped instantly, turning, not looming, not interrogating, just meeting his eyes long enough for him to understand she'd seen enough fear in her lifetime to recognize the kind that lived in men who'd been broken by something they never chose. She didn't ask. She simply led him on a slightly curved path that gave the horse more distance, and Jonas felt heat rush up his neck. Not from the sun, but from the way she adjusted to him, without making him feel small. The ranch came into view slowly. A weathered barn, a house with a porch leaning a bit to one side, a line of wash drying stiff in the heat, everything worn but clean, everything humble but alive. And Jonas's throat tightened because it looked like a place where a man might, in some impossible future, feel safe if he dared to believe he deserved such a thing. Mara set his suitcase on the porch with a careful thud, wiped dust from her palms, and pushed open the door, then waited, not commanding, not ushering, simply giving him the choice to step inside. Jonas swallowed hard, his voice trapped somewhere behind years of being told he wasn't enough. But he nodded once, small and careful, and crossed the threshold, knowing he carried more ghosts than belongings. And yet, for the first time in months, none of them felt as loud as the silence she offered him. And as the door creaked shut behind them, the heat outside faded, leaving only the strange, unfamiliar feeling that he had not walked into a stranger's home, but into the first room in years where nobody expected him to be anything other than a tired man trying to survive. The house smelled faintly of bread and wood smoke, a quiet scent that didn't demand anything from him. Jonas paused just inside the doorway, unsure where to stand. Mara didn't speak. She simply lit a lamp, and the soft orange glow settled over him like a blanket he wasn't ready for, revealing every sharp angle of his hunger, every bruise beginning to yellow, every place where life had carved him down to the smallest version of himself. And the moment he realized she could see all of that, his breath hitched. But she didn't stare. She didn't flinch. She didn't fill the silence with empty reassurances. She only set the lamp on the table and stepped aside, as if giving him permission to exist without performing strength. Jonas kept his hands close to his sides, fingers twitching from an old habit of bracing for questions, orders, or suspicion. Because most people who saw a broken man wanted to know how he broke, and most never liked the answer. Mara simply moved to the cupboard, took out a tin cup, and filled it with water, her movements slow enough that he could understand every step before she did it, a mercy he didn't know he needed until he felt his shoulders loosen a fraction. She set the cup on the table, not pushing it toward him, just placing it gently within reach, before walking a few steps away to hang her hat on a peg. And the gesture left him staring at the water with something almost like fear, because he hadn't had anyone offer him anything without wanting something in return since he was a boy. The floorboards creaked as Mara crossed to the stove, where a pot simmered quietly, steam curling into the dim air. Jonas watched without meaning to, drawn to the steadiness of her movements, the way she filled the space without crowding it, the way she stood tall but never cast a shadow that swallowed him, and it struck him, sharp and unexpected, that she wasn't treating him like a guest or a husband or a hired hand, but like a person she wasn't afraid to share silence with. He stepped closer to the table, each movement deliberate, as though his body belonged to a man twice his size, and wrapped both hands around the tin cup. The metal was cool, grounding, and when he took the first sip, his throat tightened from the shock of clean water instead of the gritty river scoop he'd grown used to on the trail. Mara glanced over, not checking on him, not monitoring him, just acknowledging the moment he finally drank, and something in her expression softened. Not pity, not triumph, just a quiet recognition that a man willing to show his smallest weakness in front of a stranger was far braver than the ones who hid behind noise and swagger. Jonas set the cup down with a careful clink, aware of how his fingers trembled even more now that the worst of his thirst had eased, and Mara returned to the table carrying a bowl of stew so hot it sent, the kind made from yesterday's meat and whatever vegetables survived the heat, wrapped around him like a memory he didn't have. Then she placed it in front of him without a word, and stepped back, hands folded loosely in front of her, giving him room to choose again. He lifted the spoon slowly, expecting the old shame to rise, expecting the room to tilt or his pulse to race, and instead the first mouthful made his eyes burn so fiercely he had to blink hard to steady himself. Because the taste wasn't special or fancy or even particularly seasoned. It was just warm, gentle food made by someone who hadn't looked at him once, like he was a burden. And in that soft lamplight, with the giant widow watching him like a soul learning to rest instead of a problem to fix, Jonas realized this was the first wordless exchange he'd ever had where silence didn't punish him. It healed him. Jonas finished the last spoonful slowly, almost apologetically, as if eating too much too fast might offend the quiet that held the room together. Mara didn't rush him. She didn't praise him for eating, and she didn't soften her posture into anything sentimental, choosing instead to stand with her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair as though she was simply keeping him company. And the steadiness of that posture unnerved him in a way kindness never had. Because most people who'd been kind to him before eventually demanded payment in obedience or gratitude he couldn't always give. When he finally set the empty bowl aside, his breath stuttered in his chest, a tremor running up his spine like an old warning. This was the moment things usually shifted, the moment a voice would rise, or a hand would gesture sharply, or a debt would be named, and he braced despite himself, shoulders tightening, hands curling slightly, heart thudding against bruised ribs as memory overlapped the lamplight until he couldn't separate past threats from present shadows. Mara noticed him shrinking inward without letting the surprise show on her face. She only reached for the bowl, lifted it from the table with the same calm she had shown since the first moment she stepped between him and the sun, and turned to the wash basin with a slow, even stride that made the floorboards whisper instead of groan, giving him time to catch up to himself. Jonas pushed to his feet too quickly, nearly knocking the chair back, his breath sharp in the stillness, and Mara paused. Just paused, her head turning slightly, as if making room for whatever struggle twisted through him. He opened his mouth, searching for words he didn't know how to form, then closed it again, his throat closing around explanations that felt too jagged to speak out loud. Because how did a man confess he wasn't afraid of the person in front of him, but of everyone who had come before? Mara set the bowl into the basin, not with a clatter, but with a controlled, gentle touch that made the whole room feel safer. And she didn't turn around, not right away, because she understood there were moments a man needed to see someone's back instead of their eyes. Proof that he wasn't being watched, cornered, or measured, only witnessed quietly. Jonas steadied his breathing, though the tremor in his hands didn't fade, and he took one hesitant step toward the doorframe. Not to leave, but to put his back against something solid. Because he trusted walls more than people, and he hated that truth even as he leaned into it. Mara finally turned, wiping her hands on a cloth, and her gaze settled on him with an unreadable softness, not coaxing him forward, not urging him to relax, simply waiting for him to decide who he wanted to be in this moment. His voice came out cracked when he finally spoke. "I don't want to cause trouble." Mara blinked once, slow and almost tender, then gave a small nod as if acknowledging a truth she already understood long before he said it. And the way she stepped back, creating more space rather than closing it, felt like the cleanest breath he'd taken since arriving. She motioned toward a small room at the end of the hall, her gesture quiet but firm, telling him he had a place to rest. A place to put down whatever weight he carried, without explaining himself. Jonas hesitated, fear and gratitude locked in his chest, and for a moment he could only stare at her broad silhouette in the dimming light, unsure how to accept kindness that didn't come with chains. And when he finally nodded and walked toward the room, his steps were slow and uneven, but they were his, chosen freely for the first time in a long, long while Mara stayed exactly where she was, giving him the miracle of privacy in a world that had never once allowed him to be fragile without consequence. The small room felt too clean for a man like Jonas, its single bed neatly made, its quilt patched but warm, its window cracked open to let in the cool night air. He stood just inside the threshold, unsure how to enter a space not bruised by shouting or fear. Mara didn't follow him. She simply set a folded blanket on the foot of the bed. And in the silence that followed, lit only by the first low rumble of a storm moving over the ridge, the air changed from dusk to something calmer, and Jonas felt the edges of his panic slowly soften under the weight of her wordless presence, because she didn't ask if he needed anything. She already knew he needed the chance to speak nothing at all. She left the doorway with the steady grace of someone who had mastered the art of not overwhelming fragile things. And for a long moment Jonas stood in the center of the room, trembling with the heaviness of exhaustion that hit only after a man believed he was finally safe enough to collapse. Then he sat on the bed and pressed both hands over his eyes, overwhelmed by a kind of quiet he hadn't felt since childhood. The storm drifted closer, a low roll of thunder shivering through the walls, and with it came a soft knock, 3 light taps, careful, almost apologetic. And when Jonas looked up, Mara stood in the doorway with a small tin box in her hands, her brows raised slightly as if asking permission, rather than assuming anything belonged to her now that he lived under her roof. He nodded once, small and barely visible, but she saw it because she watched people the way ranchers watch weather. Patiently, with attention tuned to every shift. She stepped inside, opened the tin, and revealed a few simple supplies. Salve, clean cloth strips, a small jar of moonshine for cleaning wounds. Nothing fancy but all well organized, the kind of set a woman kept when she expected to mend animals, and men alike. Jonas stiffened, instinctively ready to refuse help he didn't think he deserved. But Mara simply knelt beside the bed, not towering now, not commanding, only grounding herself low enough that he didn't have to look up at her, and she held out the cloth as though she were offering him control over his own relief. His hands shook as he took it, the movement barely steady enough to dip the fabric into the jar, and when the sting hit his bruises, he gasped softly, shoulders curling inward. But Mara didn't reach for the cloth, didn't take over, didn't assume he needed her to do the touching. She only placed one broad, steady hand on the edge of the bed, close enough for him to feel her presence, but far enough that he could finish tending his own wounds without feeling helpless. He winced when the cloth brushed a deeper bruise on his ribs, breath catching hard, and only then did she raise her hand. Not to touch, but to pause the moment, her fingers hovering in the air in silent question. And Jonas lowered the cloth, unable to hide the pain that knifed through him. She reached forward with slow, open movements he could follow from start to finish, then took the cloth from his trembling grip, and when she pressed it gently to the darkened bruise, her touch was firm enough to be useful, but soft enough not to startle him. The kind of strength that asked nothing except permission to help. He exhaled shakily, the tension bleeding out of him in a way he hadn't planned, and as the storm broke outside, rain pattering softly on the roof, thunder rolling like distant hooves, Jonas let himself lean half an inch toward the warmth she offered, not enough to burden her, just enough to let her know the world had not been gentle with him for a very long time. And Mara, understanding more from that small tilt than from any words he could have spoken, continued cleaning each bruise with the same careful rhythm, healing him not through tenderness or passion, but through the quiet courage of staying beside a broken man until the worst of the shaking passed. The storm eased sometime after midnight, leaving the room washed in a cool blue glow that drifted through the cracked window like a breath the world had been holding. Jonas sat on the edge of the bed with the cleaned bandages resting loosely around his ribs. Mara hadn't moved far, and the quiet between them deepened into something that didn't feel heavy or expectant, only steady. The kind of silence that made it clear she wasn't waiting for him to speak or confess or explain. She was simply staying because she understood that wounds didn't heal faster just because someone wanted them to. She rose slowly, brushing dust from her knees, and began putting each item back into the tin box with a precision that was neither brisk nor careful, but thoughtful in a way that matched the calm rhythm of her breathing. Jonas watched her in the moonlight, struck by how a woman so large, so strong, so forcefully built by the world she lived in, could move with the softness of a person who refused to break anything already fragile. A breeze whispered across the floorboards, carrying the scent of rain and sage, and Jonas closed his eyes for a moment, letting it cool the heat that lingered beneath his bruises, letting it remind him that the night outside was wide and forgiving, even when the memories inside him were not. Mara noticed the shiver that ran through him, the way his shoulders tightened as though bracing for a cold he didn't trust. So she reached for the folded blanket at the foot of the bed, shook it out once, and draped it near, but not on, him, letting him choose if he wanted its warmth, instead of assuming she knew what he needed. That small mercy stole the air from his lungs more than pain ever had. Jonas opened his eyes, his gaze drifting to her hand resting on the blanket's edge, fingers relaxed and open, not coaxing him, not guiding him, just existing within reach. He didn't take the blanket right away. He didn't reach for her hand. He simply stared, caught between wanting to trust the quiet she offered and fearing how quickly quiet could turn into something else. Because life had taught him that calm was the moment before shouting returned. Mara didn't rush him. She didn't shift or speak or change the angle of her body. She only moved to the far side of the room, giving him space to let his thoughts settle like dust after a stampede, and she leaned lightly against the doorframe with her arms loosely crossed, a posture that looked more like resting than guarding, Jonas finally gathered the blanket in both hands, pulling it around his shoulders with a slow, uncertain motion. And when he did, he caught the faintest flicker of relief in Mara's eyes. Not relief for herself, but for him. The way a person breathes easier when someone else finally finds even a sliver of comfort. The moonlight shifted across her face, softening the strong line of her jaw. And for the first time, Jonas saw not the giant widow who carried him home without a word, but a woman who had known her own share of silence, her own battles, her own wounds that healed slowly and without witnesses. He lowered his gaze, unsure how to absorb the weight of being seen without being judged, and Mara pushed gently off the doorframe, walking toward the hall with a quiet step that didn't disturb the night or the space he had carved for himself. She paused in the doorway, looked back only once, and gave a small nod that said everything words couldn't. That he was safe, that he didn't owe her anything, that rest wasn't a debt but a gift freely given. Jonas exhaled a breath that trembled on the way out, letting the blanket settle around him, letting the room feel real, letting the silence become a bridge instead of a threat. And as Mara disappeared down the hallway, leaving only moonlight and the soft settling of the house for company, Jonas felt something shift in his chest. Not healing, not hope, but the first fragile understanding that he wasn't alone in a world that had always been too loud for him to survive. Jonas woke before dawn to the soft creak of the house settling, the storm clouds thinning into pale streaks across the sky. His ribs ached sharply. His throat felt tight. And the unfamiliar peace of waking in a room without shouting, boots, or threat unsettled him more than any nightmare could have, because safety was a feeling he didn't know how to inhabit without expecting it to vanish like everything else that had once been good. He swung his feet to the floor, wincing at the pull across his side, and for a moment he simply sat with his hands braced on his knees, trying to decide whether he belonged in a house like this, or if staying would only stain something gentle with the shadows he carried. Then he heard faint movement in the kitchen, Mara's steady steps, her calm preparations. The low clink of cookware, and the sound steadied him more than any prayer had ever done. He followed the noise, moving slowly down the hallway, and when he reached the doorway, he froze, because the sight before him was startling in its simplicity. Mara tending to the stove in the dim firelight, her braid hanging loose down her back, her broad frame outlined in a way that made her look less imposing and more quietly strong, as though she were rooted to the earth in a way no wind could sway. Jonas opened his mouth to speak, but shame rushed to his throat first, a flood of words he didn't want to say, that he was broken, that he wasn't worth the trouble, that she shouldn't have sent for a groom like him when she could have had a man whole enough to stand confidently beside her. Mara turned at the sound of his breath, catching. And her eyes softened in that steady, unreadable way she had, the kind that didn't pry, but invited, and Jonas felt something in him tilt dangerously close to breaking. He stepped into the room with a hesitation so sharp it made his movements uneven, and for a moment he hovered near the table, like a man afraid to trespass in his own life. Then he managed a whisper-soft confession, the only one he could force out. "I don't know if I can be what you expected." Mara blinked once, slow and calm, and then she shook her head. Not as dismissal, not as disagreement, but as a gentle correction, the kind that didn't sting because it carried no judgment, only truth. She set down the wooden spoon, wiped her hands on a cloth, and moved toward him with the cautious steps of someone approaching a spooked horse or a cornered soul, leaving enough space between them that he could retreat if he needed to. Jonas didn't retreat. He stood frozen, breath shallow, waiting for her to tell him he wasn't enough, but instead she lifted one large, steady hand and placed it, not on him, not to claim or comfort, but lightly on the back of the chair beside him, a gesture that said he didn't have to stand alone if he didn't want to. It wasn't touch, it was permission. Jonas felt his chest cave inward with a trembling exhale, because no one had ever offered him a place without demanding something in return. He reached out with unsteady fingers, gripping the top of the chair to keep himself upright, and Mara didn't move, didn't crowd, didn't ask for explanations. She only stayed close enough that he could sense her strength without being consumed by it. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows gently, and in that fragile early morning glow, Jonas made the quietest, bravest choice of his life. He let himself lean a fraction closer to the presence that didn't demand he be healed or whole, only honest. And Mara, reading that shift with the same instinct she used to read weather and wounded animals, nodded once. A tiny, powerful affirmation that marked the true turning point between them. Because a man who admitted his fear was a man ready to begin. The wind grew harsher by mid-morning, kicking dust across the yard in thin, swirling lines that tugged at the laundry hanging near the barn. Jonas stepped onto the porch carefully, one hand pressed to his ribs. Mara followed behind him without hurry. And for a few seconds, the ranch felt like a world paused in place. Quiet, wind-scarred, holding its breath, until the sound of horse hooves broke the stillness, sharp and heavy, the kind that carried tension long before their riders appeared at the gate. Jonas stiffened instantly, shoulders locking, breath shortening as three men rode into view. Neighbors, but not the friendly kind, men with narrowed eyes and slouching confidence, the sort who had already formed opinions about Mara's marriage long before they decided to express them. Their horses snorted and pawed the dirt as the men dismounted, glancing from Jonas to Mara with thin, mocking half-smiles that said they believed themselves righteous, or at least entitled to speak on matters that weren't theirs. Jonas tried to step back into the house, instinct clawing at his spine. But Mara reached out, not touching him, not pulling him forward, just shifting 1 inch closer in a way that blocked the doorway with her presence alone, a silent reminder that he didn't need to hide in his own home. The tallest of the men, Holt Farrow, adjusted his hat and spat into the dirt before speaking. "We heard the mail order groom came in yesterday," he said lightly, though the tightness around his mouth betrayed the bitterness underneath. "Didn't think you'd be marrying someone so thin a wind could blow him sideways." Jonas flinched at the words, shame rising so fast it felt like heat against his skin. But Mara didn't move, didn't bristle, didn't even angle her shoulders differently. She simply stared at Holt with the calm steadiness that made most men rethink their bravado, and for a moment Holt shifted his weight uncertainly. The second man, Jeb Crowder, stepped forward with a smirk. "We figured you must have been desperate, Mara," he drawled. "A woman your size needs someone strong." Jonas's breath stuttered, and he curled his hand tighter around the porch railing, half expecting Mara to push him inside or step away out of embarrassment. But she didn't budge. Instead, she took one deliberate step forward, just one, and the porch board creaked beneath her weight, as if announcing her presence to the wind itself. And the men quieted instinctively because she didn't need to raise her voice to shift the balance of the moment. The third rider murmured something under his breath, something Jonas didn't entirely hear, but understood enough to feel the sting. And Mara lifted her chin, her braid catching the wind, as she looked each man in the eye with a patience sharp enough to cut. She didn't argue. She didn't defend Jonas. She didn't list his worth or explain why he belonged beside her. She simply moved to stand between him and the men, not hiding him, not sheltering him, but placing herself where their words had to go through her before reaching him. And in that stillness, the entire ranch seemed to lean into her strength. Holt tried to hold her stare but faltered when she didn't blink, and he cleared his throat with forced bravado. "Just making sure you're safe, Mara," he muttered. "We care about you." She tilted her head slightly, the smallest gesture of disbelief, and the message landed harder than any threat. She knew exactly what kind of care these men offered, the kind wrapped in judgment and ownership rather than respect. Jonas watched her, breath trembling, because he'd never seen anyone stand for him without anger or noise, only presence, only truth, only a quiet refusal to let the world shrink him further. And Mara, feeling the moment settle, stepped back toward him, slow and steady, until her shoulder was near his without touching, and the public tension snapped like a rope stretched too thin, leaving the men with nothing to grasp. Holt muttered a curse, kicked at the dirt, and climbed back onto his horse. The others following with forced swagger that didn't hide their unease, and as they rode off into the wind, Jonas exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, one hand gripping the railing to keep from shaking. Mara didn't look at the retreating men. She only looked at Jonas, and the steady warmth in her eyes said everything he hadn't been brave enough to ask. That he had not been humiliated, that he was not a burden, and that she wasn't ashamed to stand between him and a world that had been too loud for him to survive alone. The wind calmed as the sun climbed higher, its early light washing the ranch in soft gold that clung to the porch railings and caught the edges of Mara's braid like quiet fire. Jonas stood very still, fingers still curled around the wood. His ribs ached, and the sting of the men's words lingered in his chest longer than he wanted, twisting into old wounds he thought he'd buried somewhere along the long, brutal road that brought him here. But now they felt fresher, because someone had witnessed them with him, instead of leaving him to carry the weight alone. Mara walked down the steps and into the yard with the same steadiness she'd shown all morning, her boots brushing through the dust in a slow, deliberate rhythm. She didn't chase the men's shadows or watch the path they took, because she knew they weren't the ones who needed tending. Jonas swallowed hard as she approached, heart hammering unevenly, terrified that she might offer pity or reassurance he wasn't ready for. But instead Mara stopped a few feet from him and turned her face toward the rising light, as if letting the sun decide how the moment should unfold. The gesture was so gentle, it made Jonas's throat ache. He stepped forward hesitantly, shoulders tense as though he expected to be scolded for not being strong enough, but Mara shifted her stance. Not closer, not farther, just anchoring herself in a way that made her presence feel like a safe place he didn't have to earn. Jonas tried to speak, but the words tangled in his chest like knotted rope. "They're right," he whispered finally, the confession scraping out of him with more pain than he'd intended. "I'm not what you deserve." Mara didn't react. Not in disbelief or impatience or hurt. She simply waited, letting the silence grow soft around them instead of sharp, and Jonas felt his voice tremble as he forced the rest out. "I'm broken." He hated the sound of it. He hated that he believed it. He hated that years of surviving had carved that belief deeper than anything else. But Mara took a slow breath, her chest rising with the calm certainty of someone who had heard far worse truths and still believed people could choose their way back to themselves. Then she lifted one large, steady hand and extended it, palm open, not to pull him, not to rescue him, but to let him decide if he trusted himself enough to accept the space she was offering. Jonas stared at that hand, his breath shallow. Because it wasn't the gesture of someone trying to fix him. It was the gesture of someone who had already accepted him exactly as he was. His fingers twitched once, twice, then he raised his hand with a trembling slowness, the movement fragile as sunlight on water, and he rested his palm against hers. It wasn't a grasp. It wasn't even a full touch. It was the faintest meeting of skin against skin, and yet the moment it happened, Jonas felt something in him ease so deeply he almost staggered. A warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the sunrise, and everything to do with the quiet strength in her eyes, the kind that said, "You are not a mistake I need to justify." Mara curled her fingers gently, not tightening, not claiming, just holding the moment steady enough that he didn't have to fear it slipping. And Jonas's breath broke in a soft, shaking exhale that felt dangerously close to crying. But he didn't hide it. He let it rise because she wasn't looking at his weakness. She was looking at his courage. She stepped half a pace closer, allowing their shadows to merge in the sunlight, and Jonas felt the first flicker of something he'd nearly forgotten how to recognize. The sense that he wasn't being forgiven for being broken. He was being seen for surviving anyway. And that quiet recognition settled into the morning like a truth neither of them needed to say out loud, because it was already written in the way their hands stayed together long after the wind stopped moving. The morning softened into something gentler as the sun lifted fully above the ridge, warming the boards beneath their feet and turning the dust in the yard into a faint golden haze. Jonas loosened his hand slowly from Mara's, though the warmth lingered in his palm long after. The air felt new, and as they stood together on the edge of the porch, the silence between them deepened into a peaceful stillness that didn't ask him to be brave or healed or anything other than the tired man who had survived long enough to find a place that didn't shrink from his broken edges, and the relief of that truth made his chest feel painfully full in a way he hadn't expected. Mara stepped down into the yard first, her boots leaving soft prints in the dust, and Jonas followed her at a pace that steadied with each breath. Moving not because he was expected to, but because it felt like the first choice he'd made in years that didn't come from fear, she guided him toward the barn with a subtle tilt of her head, a wordless invitation to see the heart of her world rather than the edges of it. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and leather and the faint sweetness of grain, the kind of scent that reminded Jonas of childhood memories he rarely let himself touch anymore. Memories of standing with his mother in their tiny stable before life broke open in all the wrong ways. He paused just inside the shadowed doorway, unsure if he was intruding on something personal. But Mara glanced back, her expression warm and unguarded, and lifted one hand toward the gentle gelding resting in a stall nearby, letting Jonas choose if he wanted to take another step. He did. Slowly. Carefully. The gelding flicked its ears and sniffed the air, and Jonas held his breath, afraid the animal would sense everything he carried and shy away. But the moment stretched quietly until Mara reached out and laid her palm against the horse's neck, her touch steady and patient. And then, only then, she nodded to Jonas, offering the moment like a gift rather than a test. Jonas lifted his hand, stopping an inch from the gelding's coat as doubt surged through him. But Mara shifted her hand just slightly, closing the space without closing in on him, and he realized she wasn't asking him to be fearless. She was offering to share some of her courage until he found his own. He touched the horse gently, breath trembling, and the soft warmth beneath his fingers loosened something locked deep inside him, a quiet undoing he hadn't known he needed. The gelding leaned into his palm with a small sigh, and Jonas swallowed hard, shoulders lowering as though releasing years of tension one slow beat at a time. Mara stepped back then, giving him space to stand in the center of a moment he'd earned through survival alone, and for a long while they remained in the soft barn light, the morning stretching around them like a blanket no storm could steal away. When Jonas finally turned toward her, there was no fear in his gaze, only a calm, aching gratitude that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. and Mara answered it with the quietest smile, a small upward shift of her mouth that felt like sunrise settling into human form. Together, they walked back toward the house, neither reaching for the other nor stepping away, simply matching their strides in a rhythm that felt natural, unforced. Chosen. Jonas paused on the top step, taking in the porch, the house, the land that rustled like a sleeping thing waking to a gentler day. And he realized, slowly, truthfully, that he wasn't standing in a place he had to earn. He was standing in a home being shaped around him one quiet moment at a time. And as Mara opened the door and sunlight spilled into the entryway, Jonas stepped inside with her, leaving behind the last remnants of a life defined by fear, and beginning the first morning of a life where silence didn't wound him, but healed him, where strength didn't demand noise, and where a giant widow had shown him, without a single word, that he was no longer alone. Please like, share, and subscribe to help us tell more quiet, healing stories on Echoes of the West. If you saw a woman stand between a broken man and a cruel crowd, would you stand with her or stay silent?